And so the Associated Press, they just, as after the election, sent a memo to all of its, so the Associated Press goes to every newspaper in the country and around the world. We use their style guide because, just to have a style that is consistent throughout most news organizations. And so what they say is, anytime you use alt-right, you have to put it in quotes, which generally we don't like quotes, but we put that in those air quotes. And we say it's an offshoot of conservatism mixing racism, white nationalism, and populism. So this is the idea, you're not going to use alt-right unless you include this somewhere in the story. Now my fear, Donnie and I just talked about this, my fear is that definition gets lower and lower in the story, and maybe then it stops appearing in the story because we're limited on space, we're limited on things. The New York Times says, don't use labels. Actually, Paula did this great study to see where they're really doing this. I'm really excited about this. Anyway, so does the New York Times use alt-right? I think they probably do. But they probably, I'm hoping that they have a definition in it. But the New York Times is a standard that many people read the New York Times, consider it authoritarian, and we do what the New York Times says. So this is an important style thing. So that's just to think about how we refer to things and how journalists term things. Alt-right fits great in the headline. You know, a group that mixes racism, nationalism, white supremacy doesn't really fit in the headline, right? And so we have these problems of trying to figure out how we can accurately refer to things, yet deal with our space and time limitations.
I guess I gotta stand now. So I just wanted to talk about the alt-right movement in terms of a perspective of a woman of color, kind of mixing the race issues and also their view of feminism and sexism and those types of issues. So as many of us have discussed, the awfulness of Breitbart News and its combination of the leading forces, Steve Bannon and as well as Richard Spencer, has really led to perpetuating a lot of deep racist, white nationalist, and sexist sentiments. And as we've touched on, also using the term alt-right without clarifying what its actual intentions are helps to normalize the term, right? It's, you know, it's alt-right. It's not that bad. It's like they're not wearing hats, right? So I think it's really important to follow up our conversations with here's what the alt-right actually is. I don't know how many of you are SNL fans, but Aziz Ansari did a really great monologue last Saturday night talking a little bit about the aftermath of the Trump presidency and how it's really affected our psyche and our attitudes and actions towards racism. He kind of coined it as a casual white supremacy and the lowercase KKK. So all the people who have seen the Steve Bannons and the Donald Trumps who have been perpetuating racism say, oh, our leaders do it, so it's okay for me to dip my toes in the water of racism. So kind of trying to stop that process is going to be difficult, but I want to go through some examples and a little bit of the origins of the racist and sexist undertones of kind of their so-called movement. I think it's interesting, and if anyone tries to say that they are not neo-Nazis, there's a lot of really, really anti-Semitic language and attitudes within their movement. When Richard Spencer, the guy who was leading the movement, asked about the use of the swastika and the use of the words KKK, he said, I'm not gonna hamper on their free speech. I don't think it's wrong, right? So their attitude is to blame Jews for the plight of white culture. And so they believe that Jews are to blame for white people being the minority or suffering in some sort of aspect. Even some of their members and the fringe members have been questioning the legitimacy and whether the Holocaust actually happened. So that's of their origins. In other ways, relating to other races and other movements that Etienne touched on, stemming from social media, they have a lot of hashtags on #WhiteGenocide because they believe that Black Lives Matter was part of an orchestrated eradication campaign of white people. A lot of boycott Star Wars because there was a black person in Star Wars. And their own publications on the harms of liberals and progressives are the rising tide of ideological autism. Really, really inflammatory, awful language. But they say they're not racist. They're just unapologetically embracing a new identity politics that prioritizes the interest of our own demographic. So we're not racist, we're just prioritizing ourselves over everyone else. So I'm going to switch a little bit of the sexism and their focus on women. They have, like it was mentioned, it's a movement that's targeted towards young white males, right? And really only young white males. It's kind of seen as a method to socialize and to make friends and stuff like that. But they're using that, as Vox calls it, a gateway drug to engaging in their other racist ideologies. They don't really see their views as sexism. They more see it as feminism is repressing and oppressing them. They think that feminism has ruined modern society and that women should not be allowed to make foreign policy. It's not that they're weak, but it's that they're so awful and vindictive that they'll ruin everything for everyone else. And these are actually quotes that they've said before. And so their ideology is very focused on everyone else is the enemy but the white Europeans. And again, they're not sexist, they're just prioritizing masculine and men's rights principles. And I think an undercurrent of all of this is not only the alt-right movement, but coinciding with the Trump presidency and the Trump rhetoric, is that they want to go back to a time when they were in power, and they feel really threatened by equality, because it all has a lot of patriarchal undertones. Like, if everyone is threatening them, they feel that they're losing power when it's really everyone is seeking the same power that they've had for so long. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear that they have a lot of racist and sexist undertones, and it's interesting to see if we don't call that out in those conversations and in those mentions of them and their rhetoric, it's just going to keep perpetuating, because they're going to convince more people that we are the ones to blame and that they're on the right.
All right, well, first, thank you all so much for coming. I had no idea when I started chatting with Heather about this that there would be this much interest in the campus community. So I'm just really heartened to see all of you here for this conversation. I'm very excited for the questions that you will have, so I will try not to take too much time. There are two things I want to talk about. One is, how do we communicate about or with the alt-right? Because I think that that's a very interesting question. And then second, I want to talk a little bit about, in the language and rhetoric of the alt-right, some of the ways that they have appropriated some of the critical theory and identity politics, even feminism itself, and to remake it into their white supremacy. So I want to start by saying that talking about the alt-right, talking about this specific white supremacist group is a very tough subject, because even when they offer their own definitions, even the definition from Richard Spencer of how he defines, right, he said, who are we, what does he mean by us, is that internal to the alt-right there are divisions, there are disagreements, there are different kind of subgroups that emphasize, some are more interested in white identity politics, some are more explicitly anti-Semitic, some are homophobic, others openly embrace homosexuality. And so when we are talking about the alt-right, when we're talking about alt-right ideology, we need to be very specific about what we're referring to and recognize when we're making kind of a larger generalization about the group in this larger sense, and when we're talking about specific lines of hatred and racism that flow through them. So I just want to point that out. We're not going to do ourselves any favors if we collapse this movement into one homogeneous thing that we can go out and shout at and then expect something productive, because I think it is 3, 4, or 5 overlapping ideological areas that has found some real force in the last election. I was going to talk a little bit about the ethics of do we call them alt-right, do we call them white supremacists, but a number of people have done that. I will say in the poster designs that was at the start and end of the video and that some of you have seen, I chose to leave neo-Nazi lurking in the background because there is this, Heather, I think you called it inheritance, right? There's this connection to that part of our history, that ideological lens that is kind of behind the alt-right. And I think when we talk about them, we cannot let alt-right just be euphemistic for white supremacy. We need to recognize and make that a part of our conversation. The last thing I would say is that we also cannot be facile or careless in calling people alt-right and using that as a way to stop or dismiss engagement with that. We need to talk about who are the folks that are unabashed white supremacists, they embrace that ideology, and think about how do we engage with those people. And then a second, though I'm not saying not as important, not as dangerous category, is recognizing, focusing, and speaking to the people that enable alt-right ideology. So for example, I don't know if, I don't think we should call President Trump part of the alt-right. I don't think we have enough of a connection between him and the group. That said, he is certainly, I wrote in my notes, alt-right adjacent. And what I mean by that is that there is racist and sexist language that is clearly present in his political discourse. And he has given space in his administration, in his campaign rhetoric, and with the hiring of Steve Bannon in his White House for the alt-right to take a position and have a voice. And that kind of enabling is dangerous. That kind of enabling makes the alt-right gain power. But I think to just say, oh, well, now we have this alt-right president, actually takes away some of our room to engage with the ideas and to recognize that he can give that space, and that means that we can be vocal and challenge that, and he can take it away in a way that's very different from someone who is kind of purely in that ideological lens. The second thing, and by the way, I'm not saying that to dismiss or say it's not serious. It is deadly serious. The second thing I want to say is to just talk a little bit about how the alt-right has kind of appropriated some of our academic discourse. So first of all, the alt-right mistakes racism for discrimination. So when they talk about race, when they talk about white identity, when they talk about their own experiences with what they call racism, what they really mean is discrimination. So someone who dismisses them or treats them poorly on the basis of their skin color, which is very different from the reality of racism as systemic oppression, as deep within the fabric of our society. And when we hear people talk about reverse racism or racism against white folks, we need to be very clear about challenging them about what racism is and actually means. And that's really important and really powerful. Second, so I teach a lot of critical theory, I teach a lot of cultural theory in my classes, and there are two kind of key terms that are associated with the left in particular that you hear crop up in the discourse of the alt-right. The first is political correctness. I'll be very blunt. Political correctness is not a thing. Okay? Political correctness has become a word that you can use to dismiss someone expressing a position, a care, a concern for the power of language. So we need to move away from, and when we hear folks say, oh, that's just political correctness, what they're trying to do is dismiss thinking about power in language and not have that be a concern we can care about. And as folks with voices, every one of your voices matters, we can respond to that and say political correctness isn't a thing. When you look at people talking about political correctness, they will attach it to anything that they don't agree with. And if you want to see how effective that is, anytime someone tells you that you should change or alternate your speech pattern because they don't agree with it, especially when those same people are critical of the idea of political correctness, tell them they're just being politically correct. And you can see that catch in the discourse. The second thing is you see an articulation from Richard Spencer of wanting a safe space. And safe space, especially in popular media and especially on the right, is a very misunderstood and maligned concept. And what we're seeing is this white supremacist movement taking that language and articulating, hey, you don't get to challenge us, you don't get to engage with our ideas because we just want a safe space. Note at the same time that the safe space they're demanding is communities, cities, states, and a nation that is diverse, that has deep in the fabric of its history, its construction, and its institution, contributions from folks who are white, folks who are black, folks who are brown, and that that quotation about we can't go to space, only Europeans can go to space, we can't go to space without math, and we don't have math without the Arab world. So that safe space and that demand for space is one that says you cannot challenge our ideas. And hate and white supremacy grows when we don't challenge it.
Well, let me be the first to thank our panelists for that intriguing and fiery panel. And let's give another round of applause, especially to our students. It can be really person who gets to moderate, I also get to ask the first question. So I'm going to start us off with a question about our identity as Creighton students, faculty, and staff. Do Creighton's Jesuit charisms obligate us to engage with the rhetoric of the alt-right? How does our mission affect or influence or drive our conversation, both now and in the future?
I think in some ways the quick and easy one is if we are truly women and men for and with others, how can we tolerate or accept divisive rhetoric? How can we even respond to calls to start deciding who is and who is not American at this point, and then enacting separation and violence based on that?
I think also this idea of people are not equal, there are specific people that are more important. Besides being very dangerous, there's no asterisk on cura personalis, right? When we talk about care for the whole person, when we talk about care for our fellow faculty and staff, for our students, for one another, for building a community, we don't get to just pull people out on the basis of racial identity and say, you don't deserve that capacity for care. The other thing that I'm very interested in is in terms of as an institution, our Catholic identity, our theology, we don't get to separate by races. That's not something that we have the privilege of doing. And there's a very long history in America of white supremacy, using the Bible and using a version of God that supports those endeavors. We cannot forget that slavery itself had biblical justifications. And so we need to attend to that we are all God's creations.
You know, I would add too, and I don't mean to take up too much time, but we also are called to be truth seekers. And the fact that somebody holds a very vehement opinion or feels like it's connected to their own feeling of being threatened,